Okay, we'll start with James here.
Yes, Brooke Signer, Jane's Defense. Just a question about the German-Turkish request for naval assistance in the Eastern European. Could you give us some sense of timing, when some decision might be made? And more important, since you know the articles and all of the rest of the constitution of NATO, under what conditions would NATO refuse to do this and why? Thank you.
We are now considering the request for NATO support for coping with the migrant and refugee crisis. And we are, of course, doing that in very close dialogue with the allies which are most affected. And there are consultations and discussions going on now. I can not tell you anything about the conclusions, but the considerations are going on now. And they will continue, and then hopefully we will have something more to tell you tomorrow, when we will then have the as a next session of our meeting, and where we are able to address this issue. I think it is obvious that when NATO allies request support to cope with such great challenge and the human tragedy related to the migrant and refugee crisis, which we see both in the Middle East, North Africa, but now also in Europe, then of course then this is something we have to look very carefully into, whether and how NATO could make a contribution and make a difference. But this is something which is being discussed and assessed now, and then we will come back to what more I can say tomorrow.
Okay, still here in the front row, gentleman there.
The enhanced forward presence sounds very like steps we have seen repeatedly before. Each time we hear of more troops, more equipment. Is there a point at which NATO says we have enough there, or will we continue to see a build-up of troops and equipment in the East?
So we will have as much presence in the East as needed, because we have to make sure that we are always able to defend all allies against any threat. And therefore we have increased our presence because we are faced with a more challenging and demanding security environment, not least caused by a more assertive Russia, investing heavily in defense, and also Russia, which has used military force to change borders in Europe and to intimidate neighbors. But as I have underlined several times, for NATO this is a question of both increased presence, but also increased ability to reinforce, to stay agile, to stay prepared, to increase the readiness and the responsiveness of our forces. And we are doing both. Moreover, we have already implemented a lot, both with the assurance measures, but also now with the plans of the United States to quadruple the funding for the European Reassurance Initiative. And this extra US funding will make it possible to fund both more presence, but also more pre-positioning, more equipment, more exercises, and all of this comes together as important elements in the adaptation of NATO. Let me underline also the importance of that the increased presence in the East will be multinational. And that's a key thing, because that will send a very clear signal that an attack on one ally will be an attack on the whole alliance. And that's the whole purpose, the whole idea with NATO, is that it's based on the idea of one for all and all for one. And that is strongly then signaled by a multinational increased presence in the eastern part of the alliance.
DG24, second gentleman there.
Mr. Secretary General, thank you very much. I would like to ask you if you can be more specific. Can you underline the difference between what has been made in the eastern part, and what are the future steps? More troops? You will include the Baltics, also Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, or the eastern flank?
What we have done today is that we have made a very important decision, and that is to decide on the principle of enhanced forward presence. Then we have asked our military planners to provide us with proposals, with recommendations, with assessments on how we can do that in the best way. And that's about the composition of the forces, the scope and the scale, and also, of course, this balance between presence and the ability to reinforce. Moreover, the US has already announced increased presence in Europe, but also funding for more presence in the eastern part of the alliance. Then we are planning to make more decisions in June, and then the final decisions at our summit in July. And this is just a step. This is one important building block, but it's not the final decision. This is showing how NATO is able to adapt, and adapt in a way which is a response to a new security environment.
Gentleman over there, front row.
Felix Kasten, Spiegel TV, Germany. How do you evaluate the Russian engagement in Syria right now? And is NATO planning anything? How is it evaluating the situation?
So we have, over the last month, seen a substantial military buildup of Russian forces in Syria and in the eastern Mediterranean. And this is something which is changing the strategic balance in the eastern Mediterranean. It is something which has created dangerous situations with a violation of NATO airspace or Turkish airspace. We saw the downing of the Russian plane, and we also seen several other violations of Turkish airspace. And we also see that Russia is mainly targeting opposition forces, and they are conducting intense airstrikes in and around Aleppo. And this has caused an increase in the number of people fleeing the country and more suffering. The important thing now is that we need to support all efforts to find a political negotiated solution. And the problem with the Russian bombing is that it is undermining the efforts to find a political negotiated solution. Actually, when we saw that the negotiations were just or about to start, then they paused because of the, or for several reasons, but not least because of the Russian bombing. So what we need now is calm, de-escalation, and increased efforts to reassume the negotiations and to find a political, negotiated, peaceful solution to the crisis in Syria. That's not easy, but that's the only way forward.
Kommersant.
Thank you very much, Kommersant newspaper, Russia. Mr. Stoltenberg, we already know that the United States committed to spend $3.4 billion on improvement of their positions in Europe. But what about other NATO members? Do you have exact figures how many other NATO members are going to spend on improvement of their stance on the eastern flank? And what total amount of troops will be stationed on the eastern flank in 2016? Thank you.
We have seen the announcement by the United States, or the plans they have announced. We have seen what NATO allies have already done with the assurance measures, with also more planes in the air policing, with more ships in the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and also more troops on the ground, more exercises. And then there were made some new commitments or announcements at the meeting today. But it's too early to add them all up. We will do that later. And we will come back to more specific figures and the scope and the composition of the forces later on. because this is, as I said, one important milestone. NATO agrees on the principle of increased presence. We are starting to, what shall I say, deliver on the different components, but we will add the whole thing together. And then, of course, we will then also announce what we are going to do, because we are transparent. Let me add that this is about striking many different balances. Partly the balance between forward presence and reinforcement, but it's also the balance between strong defense and dialogue. And for NATO, there is no contradiction between a strong defense and dialogue. Actually, we believe that this is complementary. And if we are strong, if we are firm and predictable, that creates the basis also for political engagement and dialogue. Yeah, we will move on, and we will announce our decisions when we are making them.
NTB? There.
Anne Vestbakke, NTB. On the NATO-Russia relations, will you have a meeting with Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Munich this week? And if so, with what agenda and topics? Will you explain this strengthened Eastern presence?
We are planning, or I'm planning for a meeting with Minister Lavrov in Munich. We have met several times before. We met in the UN during the UN General Assembly. We met last year in Munich, and we have met in other forums and in other occasions earlier. So this is part of a regular dialogue. NATO has never suspended the political dialogue with Russia. And of course, meetings with Minister Lavrov is a part of this dialogue. And we believe that to keep channels for political communication open is important. We believe that especially when times are difficult, as there are now, it's even more important that we have political dialogue and channels open between NATO and Russia. And I will underline that what NATO does is defensive, it is proportionate, and it's fully in line with our international obligations when it comes to our increased presence in the eastern part of the alliance. So this is a meeting which is part of a regular dialogue between and political contacts between Russia and NATO.
Okay, we had Agence France-Presse.
Secretary General, thank you very much. I wanted to come back to the request that you say NATO ministers are now considering. Since Monday and the meeting in Ankara with Chancellor Merkel and Prime Minister Davutoglu, we don't have details. Can you give us a general description of it, even very general, because the scope is very large. Can you give us some description of what is in the request? And also, tonight there is a dinner. Will the question of the refugees on the Syrian border with Turkey be addressed during that dinner or at another moment? And what is NATO's position on this? Thank you.
You have seen in the media that Turkey and Germany, after the Chancellor met with Davutoglu, the Prime Minister Davutoglu, and she had the meetings in Ankara, that they announced that they would ask NATO for support. And they, as you have seen in media, they spoke of different kinds of support and help from NATO. It would be wrong if I now start to go into the details and mention different kinds of capabilities or ways NATO can support in the efforts to cope with the migrant and refugee crisis, because that will only fuel speculations. And so I think that what we have to do now is to do the work inside the alliance, to address the request, to address the different proposals, then agree, and then tell you what we have agreed on. So I accept very much your question, but it will be wrong if I answer it. I will answer it when I'm ready to provide you with answers. Hopefully, I will be able to say more tomorrow, because we need this time to assess and to discuss and to elaborate a bit more on the different possible ways NATO can make a contribution. Let me add that NATO has already different capabilities and assets in the region, because in December NATO agreed on a tailored package of assurance measures for Turkey. which includes AWACS surveillance planes, air policing, maritime patrol aircraft, increased naval presence in the Mediterranean. And actually Germany has now the command ship of this naval group of NATO, and also other assets. So we have assets in the region, but I think it's wrong if I now start to speculate on whether some of these are going to be used and in what way. So this is something we are assessing right now.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for right now, but we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.